switching away from the lectionary sermon text is on Matthew 17, but we'll do some text in Luke and Acts. And I've worked on Luke and Acts for 20 years, probably, and I've written quite a number of articles. This is the one that Julie and Bruce picked out, the most important one I've written. So I'll try to explain that in a few minutes. But it begins with Jesus' first sermon. It's on Luke 4, it's on page 60. Right.
There's a bunch of people coming from coffee.
Right? Yeah. So, you know, it's right. This is Luke 4. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. You bet. And
60 in the back.
so I was saying that I'm going to make some comments on Luke and Acts, and I'll start with Jesus' first sermon in Luke 4, and it's in this New Testament on page 60. 60 is kind of hidden in the corner there at the middle of the page. Now, one of the most intriguing things, how important is the Sermon on the Mount? Fairly important. In Matthew, it's the first sermon in Matthew. Luke has the Sermon on the Mount, but he makes it second. Now, what's so important that, you know, it displaces the Sermon on the Mount? Luke moves it to chapter 6 and puts another sermon in chapter 4. I mean, from Luke's point of view, these words must be pretty important to, you know, to displace the Sermon on the Mount. Let me read. And one of the things Jesus does in this sermon, here, you know, in this Bible text, it's right in the middle, quotes Isaiah. So I'll read that little, it's kind of printed in like it's, you know, poetry, there in the second column. So Jesus quotes Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The word favor is a colorless translation, meaningless translation of that last word. It's not my favorite thing to pull Greek in a Sunday school class at home, but it's the word dektos, and it really means the year of the Lord's acceptance. Now, we are, if I understand, debating whether to accept gay and lesbian clergy as to ordain. Some people are qualified. And Luke starts off Jesus' first sermon with the question of who we accept. That's what the question is. I mean, I like talking about the Lord's favor, but this is, you know, when somebody's different from me and sort of scary to me, do I have the gospel resources to interact with these other people? That's the way the gospel of Luke begins. And the only other time in Luke and Acts, so we got, you know, what, 24 chapters and 28 chapters, that dektos, that same adjective appears. I'm going to flip around a little bit. I don't know if you can, you know, is in Acts 10. And it's you know, it's, what is this on? Let me figure out what this is. It's, you know, it's on page 126, so I'm skipping from 60 to 126. So then we're in Acts 10, and this is like at the bottom of page 126. Let's see if this is a different translation. I don't have.
We could probably find a different translation if you want me to go with.
Well, I've got two different ones here. I'm trying to use the same text that that class is using. So, So I'll read. So Peter preaches. So this is Jesus' inaugural sermon in Luke 4, right? His first sermon. And this sermon in Acts 10 is the first sermon to those outsiders. There's earlier sermons to Jewish believers, but this is the first sermon really on acceptance of those others. And in the middle of this sermon, this is Acts 10:34. Let's see what this other translation says.
Gentiles hear the good news.
Right. And can you read Peter's sermon there?
Go for it, Ben.
Want me to read?
Yeah.
Oh, I truly understand that God knows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him.
Now that word, that's the dektos, acceptable.
Acceptable.
It's just translated favor back in, but we're talking about acceptance, and that's the same term, the only other term in the two books, right? See, what's happening is that we line up all our authorities. Right? We got the prophet Isaiah, and we've got Jesus, and then the apostle Peter. Now you could, in the 21st century, they're all male, so we could have a female in there somewhere. But nevertheless, you've got Isaiah and Jesus and Peter all saying the same thing. Isaiah is saying there will come a time when God will accept those strange folks. And Jesus quotes that passage in Luke 4, saying, this is the time of God's acceptance. And then Peter does it in Acts 10. Cornelius, a Gentile. Now, that's in verse 34, 35. Anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. Now, let me skip back up a few verses. Still in Acts 10. We're going to skip up back to verse 28. So Peter's arriving at this other person's house, and Cornelius invites him in and said, well, I don't know. There's some problems from the way I'm reading the prophets. I really shouldn't be doing this, right? So in Acts 10:27, said, the apostle Peter, who's Jesus' primary disciple, right, says, verse 28, you know that it's unlawful for a Jew to associate or visit a Gentile. Now, again, I'm playing with Greek maybe more than I usually do, but anyhow, the word Gentile there is not the usual one. It's kind of a peculiar Greek term, alophilos. But the point is, it occurs 270 times in the Old Testament for Philistines. It's not just ordinary Gentiles. This is Goliath. When the word Philistine is a Hebrew word, when you translate it, when Jews translated it 270 times in the Hebrew Bible, those persons of other tribes. Now the Philistines weren't too popular in the Old Testament, right? Could read you a lot of texts about the Philistines. Now, so what Peter's actually saying is, there are problems with me going to the house of the Philistine, of Goliath. It's a sharper word even than Gentile. It's a much sharper. And you remember the story about the conflict between David and Goliath, and then Goliath enabled by the power of God to, throw a stone and hit the giant Goliath. And he wasn't invited into the people of Israel. That wasn't the story back there in this truth. But so see, it takes a lot of authority. It takes Isaiah and Jesus and Peter to say, okay, these are, this hadn't been the way we've been doing it, right? But this is the time of God's acceptance. And see, what makes it acceptable is that it's prophesied. When the early church is doing something that's, really hard to stomach, just, they line up prophecies. Like, this is prophesied, we're not violating Scripture, this is already in Isaiah, and you remember Jesus said this? See, that conflict is so sharp that it displaces the Sermon on the Mount. This question we're dealing with about whether to accept these pork-eating pagans into the pure synagogue, that causes a lot of conflict in the early church. If you read Acts, there's a whole church council in chapter 15, and they're debating back and forth. So what I'm obviously doing, is drawing a parallel between their situation and ours. And we come to a major transition about, there's a whole group of people that, we haven't really been, we've been taught their, ABC, but, they're not one of us, and they're not moral, and that's quite parallel to the situation in the first century. These people didn't, the Philistines knew nothing about kosher, or they certainly weren't circumcised, and the early church had a lot of problems taking those people in. And we have debates in the LCA around another kind of similar transition. I don't think the situations are that different, actually. And this language in Luke 4 and Acts 10 is very strong. It's about as strong a language as you could get. See, I'm arguing then that Luke Acts is evangelical, theological, but it's also dealing with a sharp political problem that people did not have an easy time dealing with. And they, we have some conflict around our social political questions. So did they. And they lined up scripture passages like we do, but this is Luke lining up Isaiah 61 and Jesus in Luke 4, and the founder in Acts 10. Do you have questions about what I've done so far, or the way?
No, you shouldn't have any hesitation of going back to your Greek, because that thing about the word is a powerful thing.
Yeah.
You've got to know that word,
Sure,
to bring it out. So
it's translated like dozens, hundreds of other times in the word Gentile, but this is not that word.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different one, and it's a loaded word from somebody who's reading scripture, right? And most we speak English mostly. They mostly spoke Greek. That is, they didn't read the Hebrew Bible enough. They were reading the Greek Bible, and the Greek Bible that said that term "allophugos," and it wasn't positive. I could read you 100 texts about what those people do, and the forces of God, lined up to fight them. And Peter's baptizing him. It just causes a kind of a gulp.
Is there any version, translation of the New Testament that uses a different word for that passage?
There's,
There's not a word in English.
Not that I know of. That
Okay.
There are, translations of this. I use a software system called Accordance. You can read the Bible in different, whatever language you want, and it's called New English Translation of the Septuagint. That is the Greek Hebrew, and it uses the allophiles. It's such a particular term that it doesn't translate that into English. It just leaves that term there, but so all the way through that story in 1 Samuel 17 about Goliath, we read about him as an allophile. Let me argue like this. In my own life, there are certain major transitions. I was raised on a farm away in Texas, and went to seminary in New York City, and went to study Germany. My head flipped around. I think in the history of the people of God, like in our own lives, there are transitions. There are major fulcrum points where I guess I'm the same person I used to be, but wow, somehow